think it looks like the number of people joining is stabling off. So I'm going to go ahead and get started so we can respect everyone's time because we have a lot of people signed up tonight to provide testimony. So I'm Stephanie Swanson from the League of Women Voters of Texas. I'm also a leader in the Fair Maps Texas Coalition. And I just wanted to say welcome to everyone and thank you so much for contributing to this virtual public input hearing on redistricting. Very excited that everyone is here tonight and is ready to provide testimony and input. So this is a huge, huge deal, at least for the Fair Maps Texas Coalition. So yeah, thanks again for joining us. We also have a few state senators and state representatives. I'm not quite sure if it's them on the line. I'm pretty sure a lot of them sent representatives from their state office. Nonetheless, I wanted to welcome them. So we have State Senator Carol Alvarado, State Senator John Whitmer, State Senator Royce West, and then we also have the Vice Chair of the Redistricting Committee, the House Redistricting Committee, Chris Turner, and Representative John Busey here in Austin. So I just wanted to say a special thanks to you guys for making the effort to join us this evening. We really appreciate it. So I'm going to go directly to Michael Lee. So excited to have him join us tonight. Michael is Senior Counsel at the Brennan Center for Justice and the Democracy Program. Michael is always featured in all of the news interviews and news articles on Texas redistricting. He is Texas redistricting. He's the expert, I should say. So we're so excited to have him with us. And with that, I'm going to turn it right over to Michael.
Great. Thank you so much, Stephanie. And thank you all for having me here. It's exciting to be actually talking about redistricting. You know, I oftentimes tell people that redistricting is a little bit like the Olympics. It occurs, in this case, every 10 years. And, you know, it's something that you may kind of remember a little bit from the past. But, you know, like when the Olympics actually happen, like they do every 4 years, like suddenly you're watching curling, you're watching like luge and all this stuff that you kind of forgot the rules about, and you kind of have to refresh yourself and like, oh yes, I remember now how like what's good and what's bad. But we're about to head into another redistricting cycle, and Texas, as always, is going to be a very exciting state. And I say exciting with a bit of trepidation because, you know, Texas for 5 decades has struggled to get its maps right. And every decade, whether Democrats have been in control or whether Republicans have been in control, at least part of the maps have been struck down for various violations of the Voting Rights Act or the Constitution, and had to be redrawn. And in some cases, the litigation takes the better course of a decade to resolve. And this cycle, I think, is not going to be different for Texas. You know, Texas, and we'll get into this a bit, but like Texas is, you know, again, one of the most dynamically growing states and changing states, and that makes and in this last election was more of a battleground state than it's been for a long time. And I think that all of that creates political risk, and I think that means that, you know, there's a lot of desire to put the thumb on the scale. And the reality, unfortunately, is that the maps will be drawn under single party control. And that's not meant to be a partisan statement, but it's meant to simply reflect that we know from studying this around the nation that when one party is in control, whether it's Democrats in Illinois or Maryland or Republicans in states like Texas, that, you know, the maps are much more biased and than they would be otherwise, right? Because people start off with something in mind, which is the political outcome they want, and then they work their way backwards to that. And so finding ways to inflect that and to put pressure on that is going to be key. But I'm going to start with just a very quick overview of Texas, what's happened since the maps were drawn, and then also a very quick overview, a high-level overview of the rules governing redistricting, because again, it's like the Olympics, you kind of forgot about some of this stuff and then you remember it. So let me start. I'm going to try sharing my screen, which you would think after 9 months I could do this effortlessly, but that doesn't always work out. But let's see. So I'm going to start. there we go. Talking about like what happened in Texas since 2010. And the reality is that Texas has been, as it was the previous decade, the fastest growing state in the country. And as you see here, like Texas is projected to add almost 4.4 million people, depending on how the census comes out. You know, there were a lot of issues with the census, but depending on how the census comes out, we think that Texas probably added about 4.4 million people. You know, that's 1.4 million more people than Florida, the next fastest growing state. And you'll just see, you know, Texas, you know, almost 1 in 5 people added to the US population were in Texas. A little bit contrary to what most Texans like to think, it is not mostly due to people moving to Texas, although that's a significant part. But it's really due to births. Texas has one of the youngest populations in the country. Only Utah has a younger population than Texas. And so most of Texas's population growth is from births. About a quarter is due to international or has been due to international migration, and a little bit more than a quarter is due to people moving to Texas from other states. So, Texas again has a very young population, and it's that is really the driver of it. And not surprisingly, there are very sharp differences in Texas in the age of the various ethnic groups, and Latinos in particular are the youngest ethnic group, and not surprisingly, as a result, most of the people added to Texas's population last decade, that out of the 4.4 million, 2.3 or so were million were Latino, but Texas also experienced very fast growth in its Black population and also its Asian populations. Altogether, the 9 white groups in Texas were about 90% of the state's population gain, compared to only about 10% for the white population. Texas's Black population growth, that you'll see there, is actually the second fastest in the country. Only Florida added more Black citizens or Black residents than Texas. So, and the Asian population, which is the smallest of all of the ethnic groups, actually grew remarkably fast. So Texas is becoming diverse at a very fast pace. And you'll see how, when you think about redistricting, you'll see how this plays out over the course of the coming decade, because this is a look at Texas's demographic curve by age. And you'll see like there is this huge Latino wave that is coming, and likewise older Texans, to a degree I don't think that people necessarily realize, are disproportionately white. Younger Texans are very heavily non-white, and so this curve, because a lot of those people who are under 18 will be over 18 by the end of the decade, and that will sort of have an impact on political power in Texas and how districts perform in Texas. But if you thought that Texas changed a lot last decade, just wait for this decade. And so as a result of Texas's very fast population growth, it's now projected, again, depending on how the census comes out, and Texas invested $0 in census turnout and had lower than response rates on the census than most states, compared to states like New York and California that spend about $100 million each on census turnout. Texas spent $0. But assuming that the census numbers come out okay, we expect that Texas will pick up about 3 congressional seats. That's after picking up 4 congressional seats the last go round. More than any other, Texas will end up with 39 congressional seats, 41 electoral votes. It is very much an emerging giant. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the Texas electorate, because that's a different dynamic than the total population, because of course you have to be over 18 to vote, and much of Texas's Latino population, for example, is under 18 still. But that still, it was really Latinos who were the bulk of the voters added in Texas last decade. Texas added about 3.3 million voters, eligible voters. Not all of them are registered, but there are 3.3 million new eligible voters in Texas since 2010. The bulk of those, as you'll see in the yellow band, are Latino. Very heavy growth in the Asian and Black electorate as well. And you'll see, if you just take the Black, Latino, and Asian voters added to Texas, that's more than all the voters added in Florida, and way more than any any other state. I mean, Texas is just dynamically adding voters and mostly voters of color. And as a result, what you saw in Texas last decade is that Texas experienced one of the steepest declines in its white eligible voters, right? There's actually a typo here. I see that it could be the steepest, sharpest declines in white voters, not non-white voters, but so about 6.6% fall off. And Texas right now is at the cusp of becoming, it's on the cusp. Non-white voters are on the cusp of becoming the majority in Texas. Right, it's projected that white voters are about 51% of the state's electorate. Over the course of the decade, that will fall below 50%. So that's a very quick overview of what Texas has been over the last decade. And now let's talk a little bit about redistricting, starting with the timeline. And so normally redistricting is in the 2021 legislative session that will begin in January. But this time it could be in a special session. It has been in the special session in the past when the legislature just ran out of time to draw maps in sufficient time. But there's additional reason why it might be in a special session this time, which is that we don't know when states will get the census data. As you'll recall, the census, or many of you will recall, the census was delayed back when the pandemic started, and the Bureau normally would have finished the census about August and spent a few months calculating the data. They didn't finish field work really until October, and as a result, they're several months behind in being able to calculate the data, and they have hemmed and hawed about when they think that they can get the data out. Texas normally would get the block level data that it needs to draw maps sometime in mid-February of 2021, but it will almost certainly be later this time. It perhaps could be as soon as April, but it more realistically might be in the summer, which of course would be after the legislative session ends, which would require a special session. In Texas, the governor controls the timing of a special session. And so, that's an opportunity. I think many people are concerned that there might be some gaming around that because, while you would want to perhaps draw the maps in the summer, you might also want to wait because as we'll talk about, one change is that Texas will no longer need to get its maps pre-approved by the federal government. And so there's no need for Texas to get its maps done early. It could get its maps done as late as like October. And then, and candidates begin filing in November. Which, wouldn't leave a lot of time for legal challenges. So there is some potential gaming around when the maps will be drawn. And part of that is being driven by the fact that the data may not come, frankly, until summer. So I want to talk very briefly about the legal rules around redistricting. And I'll start just very basically. And the long and the short is that there actually aren't that many legal rules in Texas about redistricting compared to other states. At least nothing that is hard and fast and written, in law as a requirement, either the U.S. Constitution or the state constitution or Texas statutory law. One big requirement is that districts be equally populated, and that's out of a line of cases. In the 1960s, it's very strict for congressional districts. Generally, it meets within one or two people. Although there's some greater variance allowed now. Maybe it's a few hundred people, but it's very tight. So there's almost no deviation that is permitted. There's greater flexibility with legislative districts under Supreme Court rulings, and the purpose of that is to allow you to do things like keep a town together, or keep school districts together or something like that, where that you would have to break them up if you had strict population equality. The 10% top to bottom deviation, however, has oftentimes been used in redistricting for gamesmanship. You'll underpopulate districts or overpopulate them if it's advantageous to you to protect an incumbent or to favor your party. And so, that is something that is permitted under law, but, it again provides an opportunity for gamesmanship. In Texas, as in all states, the districts have to comply with the Voting Rights Act, and that's very significant in a state like Texas that has a large non-white population. We'll talk a little bit more about what the Voting Rights Act requires in a second. In addition, but other than that, there aren't a whole lot of rules. One requirement is that districts be contiguous. That's for the Texas Senate only. That means that you can't separate them as a practical matter. Practice, that's oftentimes also been the case for state house districts, but it's not technically required. And then there are various rules on county boundaries and keeping counties whole. In addition, there are rules about how state house districts in the larger counties at least have to stay within a county. So Travis County will have a certain number of districts, Dallas County will have a certain number of districts, and they have to stay within the districts. They can't cross over that. And sometimes what you'll see happen is that because of some counties grow faster than others, some counties may lose state house districts. So Dallas County last decade lost 2 state house districts, and they had to decide which ones of those were going to be eliminated. Some counties may also lose state house districts this time, and that can create some tension because, of course, people don't want to lose their own seat. What's not required, let's talk about that. Texas does not require compactness. It does not require in its law keeping communities together. And it doesn't, as thus far, really require partisan fairness. And that nor is the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court heard a few cases out of other states last decade and then decided, like, well, you can't really bring partisan gerrymandering claims in federal court anymore because it's too political and we don't want to get involved because we're not political. That insert like the applause line there. But these are things that that some states require, Texas does not. But one of the huge things in Texas that is always a source of litigation, always a source of contention, is the treatment of communities of color. And so I want to talk a little bit about the rules around race. One big change for 2021 is, as I alluded to earlier, before in the last round of redistricting and for 5 decades before that, Texas was required to submit its maps either to the the U.S. Justice Department, or to a panel of judges in Washington to get them pre-approved. And before, and unless they were pre-approved, Texas couldn't use the map. So that's a process called pre-clearance. It was something that was required in states that had a history of discrimination, including Texas. But the U.S. Supreme Court invalidated the formula for determining what states were covered in 2013. And as a result, and because Congress has not enacted a new formula for determining what states will be bad and should be covered, that requirement will no longer apply. And that's significant because what Texas had to show in order to get preclearance was that A, its maps were not discriminatory, and then that B, that minority voting power wasn't going backwards. And that's, and the burden was on Texas. If Texas couldn't show that, the maps couldn't be used. And that was a really significant check. Without that, there's some danger that Texas, the lawmakers could try to dismantle, for example, certain minority districts or districts that are performing for minorities because there is no longer a bar on going backwards. Now, there is a constitutional bar on intentional discrimination, but intentional discrimination, requires, of course, intent and proof of intent. And before, all you had to do was show that there was an effect of going backwards, even if it was a totally good faith effect of going backwards. And so it will be harder to defend the ability of communities of color to elect in certain places. There still is Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, which I won't get into the technicalities of, but basically where there is racially polarized voting, and that's most of Texas, with white voters and voters of color preferring different candidates, and where you can draw a minority district that's, the minority community is large enough that you can draw a geographically compact district. The Voting Rights Act it will require you to do that. But that can be hard to meet in practice, particularly for Latinos and Asians, because the communities are more spread out. And so it's sometimes hard to draw geographically compact districts. And in many places, the only way that you could draw a geographically compact district would be to create a multi-racial coalition district. And it's unclear that that's allowed under the existing law. And the challenge that you run into is, as I mentioned, the Voting Rights Act requires you to draw majority-minority districts in certain instances, but the Supreme Court has said you can't think too much about race when doing that. So in other words, think about race because you have to comply with the Voting Rights Act, but don't think about it too much. And if you think about it too much, then it's a racial gerrymander. And this is a district in Dallas from the 1990s. The district now represented by Eddie Bernice Johnson. It looks very different today, but this was its original configuration. And the Supreme Court struck it down on the basis that map drawers are simply looking for every Black voter they could find to stick in the district. That seems actually to be borne out by the way that the district looks and the Swiss cheese functions on the district. So you could think too much about race, and I suspect that you will see racial gerrymandering claims potentially brought this time by both sides, by more conservative groups and by more progressive groups and communities of color. Last time, many people challenged District 35, which is Lloyd Doggett's district currently, which stretches between Austin and San Antonio, on the basis that it was drawn solely on the basis of race, trying to find a bunch of Latino voters to stick into a district. And the defense had to be like, no, there was something other than race that was driving the creation of the district. Race can be a consideration, it just can't be the predominant consideration. And so expect a lot of contentiousness around that. The other thing I will mention just very, very quickly is racial gerrymandering in these contexts seem like they're bad. And originally, racial gerrymandering cases were brought by white voters trying to dismantle districts where communities of color were electing candidates. Last decade, in places like North Carolina, we also saw racial gerrymandering used by communities of color to prevent packing. And so you'll see in this, particularly the 1st Congressional District in North Carolina to the right, you'll see map drawers drew these long tentacles out to try to find Black voters to stick into the district. And that had the effect of making a lot of districts uncompetitive in North Carolina for Democrats, and the court struck that down as a racial gerrymander. And that can be key in Texas because, as I mentioned, partisan gerrymandering claims can no longer be brought in federal court. However, in the case from North Carolina that struck down the 1st Congressional District, the Supreme Court said that even if you're using race as the means for trying to create a political advantage, that's it. You can create a political advantage, that's fine, but you can't use race as a means to do that. And if your race is a predominant means by which you create a political advantage, that can be a racial gerrymander and violate the Constitution. So that may be a very important check in Texas. So that is a very fast romp through Texas law on redistricting. And I'm sure you guys have lots of questions, and I want to leave room for answering that because all politics are local, and so is all redistricting. And so the reality is, there's a bunch of stuff that you guys will care about. And so I don't know how we're doing questions, Stephanie.
I think Karen's going to help with this. We have the raise your hand function enabled. So if you do have a question, please go ahead and raise your hand and we'll call on you in the order that you get the button.
And I'll just start with the first question that came into the chat while you were speaking, and that is, can we get copies of the slides and how?
Yes, I will send them to Stephanie, but I will correct the typo that I had in there so it doesn't confuse anyone.
Okay, great. And we have Stephen Weintraub for the first question. Stephen, you can unmute yourself if you're muted. And
I am muted?
Yes, we can hear you.
So during the hearings the House did have, there were reports from the state demographic, and he was talking about giving them reports on number of people over 18, and the implications they were thinking of drawing districts along that line as opposed to whole persons. What sort of mess will that get into, particularly in the courts?
So the issue that Stephen raises is the possibility that you could draw districts based on citizens over 18, which is, another way of roughly saying eligible voters instead of total population. Now, I think that it really realistically would be possible to do that only for the Texas Senate. The Texas Constitution requires that state house districts be drawn based on total population. And likewise for congressional districts, because congressional districts are allocated to the states based on total population, there's a really strong argument that states have to draw the districts based on total population. I suppose people could try otherwise, but I think most people would say that that's likely to be unsuccessful. The Texas Constitution is silent as to the Texas Senate. And so there's a possibility that you could try it in the Texas Senate. When the issue was litigated before the Supreme Court said, some people from Texas tried to challenge the way that Senate districts are drawn, saying that you had to draw them based on eligible voters. And the US Supreme Court, in an opinion by Justice Ginsburg, said, no, total population is perfectly acceptable, but we leave for another day whether a state might voluntarily choose to draw them based on eligible voters. Of course, the Supreme Court has changed quite a bit since 2016. And so some people think that Texas or another state may make a run at it. It would have a significant impact, particularly on Latinos. And it's not because, as many people think, there are a lot of undocumented Latinos in Texas, although Texas does have a large undocumented population. It is because Latinos have a lot of children, right? And it's the under 18 aspect. The largest group of non-voters are children, and Texas is, but the impact would be that it would take Latino representation backwards, and some people have said to 1980 levels if that happened. So something to watch for. It's not clear to me there's a huge advantage to Republicans doing that because it would also, because of the largest group of non-voters are children, right? It also would change a lot of suburban districts, like in places like Collin County and Denton County outside of Dallas, or Williamson County. So a lot of Republicans also would suffer, or their districts would change quite a bit. So it's not clear to me they would want to do that. But if they did, they would be picking a big constitutional fight. So.
Thank you, Stephen. Next up is, and I hope I pronounce this correctly, Hexo, Colorado.
Hi, yeah, you nailed it.
Yes,
I have a question about something. I'm hoping you can weigh in on whether this is in pipe dream territory or in actual thing that could happen, or somewhere in between. Is there any hope of removing the political influence on redistricting by removing the human element altogether, or at least as close to non-human as possible, where it's not it's not drawn by political players, and perhaps there's more AI or algorithms involved in the actual redistricting as opposed to elected officials. Solutions like that, pipe dream territory, real idea territory, or somewhere in between?
Somewhere in between. So computers have proven really successful in helping to identify outliers when things don't seem like they're within the range of reasonableness. And so they're very good at defining the boundaries of when you go too far, but even within things that are acceptable, they comply with all sets of reasonable rules. There's lots of room for you to reach it's like the business judgment rule, if you're familiar with that. It's a reasonable choice among the range of reasonable choices. And so, so the example I always give is in California, which has an independent redistricting commission. The commission heard lots of testimony about how the foothills in Los Angeles should be kept in one district, and it wasn't natural that, in some ways, that the community be kept in one district, because people who live in the foothills drive into the valley to work, shop, go to school. And so, historically they were joined to various valleys, foothill districts. And so, but the people in the foothills said, we don't like that. because we have one overarching concern that is not being met by people in Sacramento, the state capital, and that is wildfires. We want somebody who pays attention to wildfires and will fight for wildfire funding and services. And the commission heard that testimony and said, that's a really compelling reason to put these communities all in one district. And they ultimately ended up doing that. Now, would they have been reasonable in keeping like the foothills to valley districts that the area had in the past? Sure, that would have been totally reasonable as well. But they had to make a judgment call, and they were able to make that judgment call based on the community input. Now, where computers have been really helpful is like, identifying, for example, in North Carolina, Republicans drew a 10-3 congressional map, out where they got 10 seats and Democrats got 3, in a state that's 50-50. And, like computers were very good at showing like that wasn't something that if you were just randomly drawing reasonable districts that you would come up with. It's something that would, maybe come up in 1 in a million times or something like that. It's just not very likely. And so they can be very helpful at policing. But short of that, I think, there are lots of reforms that can be really helpful. And the biggest one is simply breaking up the one-party monopoly, right? Once you do that, once you allow one party to have a check on the process, you end up with fairer maps, because if they don't compromise, it ends up in the courts, and courts don't draw perfect maps, but they don't also gerrymander. And so, just creating a system of checks and balances, either by having a commission, in California, there are Democrats, Republicans, and independents on the commission, and each of the 3 groups has to approve a map. In other words, Democrats can't team up with independents to screw Republicans or any other combination. Some states have a supermajority requirement for passing maps, so that you have to get support, at least some support from the other party. All of those things, simply breaking up the power monopoly, can be huge.
Thank you so much. I know we're already past the 6:30 initial commitment, but do you have time for one more question?
I do. I will be glad to take.
All right. So Gavin Mason is next. And this will be our last question. Any other questions? I'll open the chat back up and people can post them there, and then maybe we can follow up with those.
Yeah. Hi, this is Gavin. Michael, in real politics, I'm independent and I would like to see I'm an engineer by background, and I'd like to see a logic applied so that the districts were allocated fairly by computer or independent commission. But in real politics, there's generally a desire for the party in power to hold on. And, so what incentive is there right now to create a commission or be more reasoned in fair boundary district drawing? Where's the common ground? Because I don't see the present power centers wanting to give it up. I think it's not an uphill battle to get fair election areas.
Yeah, it is a challenge, especially in a state where the process is political, like Texas, and where you can't do reforms like you did in California or Michigan by having a citizens ballot initiative. They reform in those 2 states. People like Arizona, they reformed the process by simply bypassing the legislature, right? And that's not possible in Texas because of the way the Texas law works. And so I think it's a longer term game. And I will point out, like it used to be, if you go back to the 80s, it was Republicans in the Texas legislature who said, we should have an independent commission. The way we do redistricting is stupid. And, Democrats were like, no, this is much better for us to, for lawmakers to draw maps. And now it's the Democrats who wanted independent commission, and it's the Republicans who are like, no, this is much better. So it is a hard process to reform. I do think there's much that can be done, and you're starting to see some of that, including tonight, right? You're getting people to actually have their input. There's when the map drawing actually takes place, there will be much more technology available to people to draw their own maps, to put those into consideration. And that's going to be huge, because you also have a media that is much better at covering this than in the past. It used to be the media covered it as a D's versus R's thing inside the dome in Austin, and that's the way that it got covered. And now people kind of understand it a lot better. And it's easier to dialogue with people through different ways. And I think, you can shame people in ways that you couldn't shame them in the past. Now, does that result in reform? No, but does it temper the maps? somewhat, and does it create a record for the court? Absolutely, and that's huge to the extent there is litigation in the courts and the process seems closed. And the example I always like to give is there was a student competition in Virginia in the last cycle where students drew maps, and there were winner. I think there were top 3 prizes, but there was a challenge to the maps that the legislature drew in court, and the legislature said, well, yes, this map is partisanly biased, but we were just trying to keep counties together as much as possible, and that there was no way to do it other than to have a little bit of bias. And the court was able to take the student drawn map and say, wait, no, there's a student competition map. The winner split fewer counties than you split, and the map isn't hugely biased, right? And it was sort of like this wonderful moment. And that was back in the day when it was relatively hard to draw maps, right? People had to give students and train them, but the software will be much more available, and there will be much more ability to dialogue with people than there has been in the past. And I suspect that will help create a narrative. And the good news is that people understand gerrymandering. If you go back 10 or 15 years, polling didn't move people. You talked about redistricting, their eyes glazed over. Now, people in Michigan who were working on the ballot initiative, they said they would go to Republican doors, they would go to Democratic doors, and everybody would sign the petition. And they just said, we want to take power away from the politicians, because there is this sense, people want to hang on to power, but there is a sense among ordinary people that the system is rigged, that the system is broken, and they don't like it. And that cuts across party lines, and it includes independents and people who support third parties. And so there's a real chance, I think, to have dialogue. But getting to a better place in Texas is probably a long game. So,
okay.
So much, Stephanie. Back to you.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Michael, for joining us tonight and giving us an update on what we can expect. We really appreciate you being here, and thanks.
Glad to do it.
Time.
Good luck. I used to live in Texas. I live in New York now, but I'm following you guys closely, so I'm pulling for you.
Great, thanks. Hopefully we can move the dial a little bit. All right, see you later.
Bye.
So I wanted to switch over now and get everyone who wanted to provide testimony, get the testimonies section going. So I think we have about 40 people that have signed up tonight. A few people dropped off, a few people moved to Thursday. So the way this is going to work is, since this is a webinar, we have the list of people that have signed up to provide testimony. What we plan to do is call you out. I sent the list to your email ahead of time, so you kind of know the order that you're going to be in. We'll call you out. Karen is going to promote you to a panelist. You'll be able to then unmute yourself and turn on your camera. We ask that you start your testimony by providing your name and which organization you're associated with, if any. If you're speaking on behalf of an organization, I should clarify that. So again, this is supposed to be very much in line with what the House and Senate redistricting committees the way that they would run their committee hearings. So we want to make sure that you're aware that you have 3 minutes to provide your testimony, and that's not a hard stop. I am going to I'll have a timer set, and if you go over, we'll let you know, but feel free to keep going. Just keep in mind that there are other people that will also want to participate and provide testimony as well, and just try to be respectful of others' time. Okay, and then after you're done, you'll go on mute and turn your camera back off, and then we'll go down the list to the next person. Through this process, I'm going to be continuously putting the next person that's up into the chat, so you guys can monitor the chat to see if you're next. Okay, so with that, I guess we'll go ahead and switch over to the testimony. The first person that is on the list.
So Stephanie, there's a couple of people at the top of the list that I do not find in the attendee list. So I have gone to the next one that is available, and that's Judy Ackerman.
Okay, great. How are you?
Go for it. Members of the Redistricting Committee, my name is Judy Ackerman. I live in El Paso. And I thank you for this opportunity to share my perspective on some things about redistricting. First, some general comments, and then some specific things about El Paso. Gerrymandering is a threat to democracy. You have the power to draw fair maps, and that's what we need you to do. When candidates have no opposition in the general election, and their only challengers come from the extremes of their own party, then the political divide deepens. Chances for dialogue, compromise, or progress of any kind are eliminated. Gerrymandering must end, and you have the power to do it, so please do. Thank you for participating and listening to the virtual public testimony. As stated by Chairman of the Senate Redistricting Committee, Joan Huffman, we need fair, legal, and open legislative redistricting process. We also need to maximize public participation. So please hold more public hearings, especially ensure that the public has a chance to comment on the maps before you vote them out of committee, and allow enough time at the hearings for the public to introduce alternate maps. Now, a couple things about El Paso. I live in House District 78, Joe Moody's district, and on a two-dimensional plane, the map looks pretty reasonable. But if you have ever been to El Paso, then you know that we have mountains that rise up 3,000 feet right in the middle of the city. These mountains are beautiful, but they are an impediment to movement. So people that live in Northeast El Paso avoid going to the west side. And people that live on the west side, they have no reason whatsoever to come to Northeast El Paso. So we have totally disparate communities of interest. I'm asking that when you draw District 78, when you redraw it, please ensure that everybody is on one side of the mountain or the other. You have the power to fix the maps. Please do. Thanks.
Thanks, Judy. Okay, our next testifier is going to be Jesus Valdez. I know he's also from our Fair Maps El Paso group. Jesus, Erin's going to promote you to be a panelist, and then go ahead and unmute yourself, and you can start your camera if you want.
Unmuting myself.
Thank you. We can hear you.
Okay, perfect. Okay, my name's Jesus Valdez. I'm also from El Paso, and I'm representing myself, not any organization. First of all, I do want to thank Fair Maps of Texas for hosting this virtual community hearings. The task ahead for our legislature is very transcendental, since our House state districts have been gerrymandered such that our democracy is severely diminished. I think we all know that. The Voting Rights Act champions, among other things, the core concept of communities of interest. If this core concept is followed, the redrawing of district maps becomes a much simpler and democratic process. My testimony today is with regards to the Texas State Representative Districts. There are currently 5 districts in the El Paso area, number 75 through 79, and these maps currently crack important communities of interest, diminishing their fair representation. El Paso is segmented by the state of New Mexico to our north, Mexico to our west and south. Our Franklin Mountains, like it was previously stated, divides west and northeast. And Interstate 10, when constructed, broke the city in half and divides what I call North Central and South Texas areas. These natural boundaries determine the natural and historical growth of El Paso, creating 5 distinct communities of interest. I shall refer to them as West Side, Northeast Side, South Central, North Central, and Far East. It so happens that using estimated 2018 population data, the first 4 districts would have roughly equivalent populations, which is one of the requirements of redistricting. And the 5th one would have a fairly similar population if it incorporates additional counties in far southwest Texas, such as Hudspeth, Culbertson, Jeff Davis, Presidio, Brewster, Reeves, Pecos, Terrell. Unlike other areas of Texas, El Paso is easily mapped. Our natural and man-made boundaries organically created over its history cohesive, compact communities of interest. I highly encourage the Texas legislature to use this proposed map for our region. There is a map in my writings, which obviously cannot be seen, but it basically has each district with roughly 180,000 people. I know that the population new data will change that number, but it's very clear that mapping for this far west side would be fairly easy. And the maps that were used to create this map was using the software DRA 2020. And that's my testimony. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jesus. Okay, so the next person up to provide testimony is Gavin Mason. Sorry, I didn't get your name into the chat box. We're trying to eliminate the people that weren't here. So Gavin Mason, you're up next.
Well, hi there. My name is Gavin Mason. I'm in Houston, and I'm representing myself and not any organization. And I sort of happened upon this meeting. So, and I don't have a prepared detailed case to put, but from listening to Michael and reading some materials around this issue, and particularly listening to Michael saying that, you know, this issue is rising in people's minds and people's desire to be an active part of their politics and the decision making in their communities. And when I work in the oil and gas business, but I work with a lot of people that are from minorities, and there's a frustration that they don't seem to have a say to power. And so I think the move to I think Michael maybe have used the word to not maybe shame, but to embarrass politicians, which is a tall order, to put things into the sunlight, I think is going to be expected. And people, you know, and that means that we basically need a certain amount of independence. That's clear criteria on how any proposed boundaries were chosen. With data, not just nice maps that don't really show mountains or other barriers, but show data on the makeup of the communities, the demographics, et cetera, and to emphasize why proposers believe those maps are fair. And that should go to public consultation when all these data analysts, some of which I know from whatever color of politics, can look at them and expose anything blatant and hopefully cause changes, hopefully not as far as the courts, but just through good publicity in the press, etc. So that the final maps would be clear. Ideally, an independent commission, but I'm not sure that's going to happen. But I think timing is, we talk about, you know, Texas going blue and the incumbent reds, and I'm an independent, you know, I can back that up, but if Republicans are worried about losing power if it went blue, then it would seem in their interests to come up with fair election boundaries so that if it does go blue, that elections are based on true representation of the people of Texas. And that gives, I think, a lot of this young wave that is coming up a sense of empowerment. And as a Texan, not born here, but I think it's people, that sense of empowerment motivates people and energizes our state to become, to increase ourselves economically and as a vibrant state. And so that's my case. Michael talked about this being a long-term thing. I think the timing means that those in power should look at making this switch earlier for their own advantage, but in the next 10 years or whatever. So that's my case. Thank you very much, and thank you to the Women League of Women Voters and those that organized this session. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Gavin. Okay, we're going to work our way down the list. I'm just going to start calling folks off. Is there a Jessie Mona Cartwright Biggs?
I did not see her on the list.
How about a Marilyn Horton?
Yes, she is here.
And just really quickly, there's a lot of talk in the chat. The way that you were supposed to sign up for testimony was on the registration page. No worries if you've missed it. You're welcome to stay on to the end. And at the end, we'll call for extra people that want to provide testimony. If you don't want to wait till the end, we're also having another testimony hearing on Thursday evening. And that's just going to be strictly testimony. We won't have any guest speakers. So that is also a possibility as well. Okay. All right, Marilyn, go ahead.
There she is. Go ahead, Marilyn.
Hi, I'm Marilyn Horton. I live in Arlington, Texas, and I'm a precinct chair of 2025. And I have been going to, God, I'm kind of dark in here. I've been going to the Represent Us, and it's a bipartisan group that's a national group, to get people to represent, our representatives to represent us. About gerrymandering, there is a study that I looked up from the University of Southern California, the Schwarzenegger Institute for State and Global Policies, and they basically are following the worst partisan gerrymandering in the US state legislations. And what they were looking at was where the popular vote was less than 59.9% total for one political party, and yet the minority party yielded more than 15% of the legislative seats following the 2018 elections. And what they found out were 10 of the most egregious ones. And the ones you'll recognize these because these are states that are having in the news polarization between the legislation and the executive branch in the state. One's Michigan, one is Wisconsin, one is Pennsylvania, and one is Tennessee. And you can see why it is so important to avoid gerrymandering so that our state can go ahead and continue to do what the majority of the Texans want us to do. So I'm really pushing for partisan fairness, whether you're Democrat, Independent, Republican, because when you get into a minority rule position, the representatives aren't going to be concerned about us. They're going to be concerned about their own party. And as a citizen, we want to be seen and we want to be heard. And understand that redistricting is so important to our vote, because when I vote, I'm going to be voting for my community. Like I said, I'm a precinct chair. I'm worried about the healthcare delivery system in Fort Worth. We just passed some bonding for to improve our triage unit, which really does cover for 4 counties. So that was really important. We also have to worry about disaster funds. We have to worry about transportation, and we need our district to be representative by the municipality that we are in. There is a policy that you can do for your procedures in the redistricting committees, and that would be if there was a minority rule that existed following a state legislative election, that it would trigger another meeting so that we could get the minority rule out. So you could go back and redo the redistricting. And you could possibly do that as a procedure rule. You could also do it as a law. As a citizen, we are going to monitor if there is a minority rule. We're also going to look for violations in compactness. We're also going looking for unnecessary splitting of municipalities, of communities of interest. And we are also going to look, I personally would like to see some of these laws about the data mining on social media, so that we don't get labeled something and then we get counted that way, because our opinions might change. We're very fluid people, and something we might understand a policy differently. And we want to be represented by what we are at that moment in time. There's been talk about a constitutional amendment for Texas. And then also we'd like to possibly see if the election laws can go back to where in the primaries, you don't have to label yourself. You can just go in and vote for people. You can do like a choice rank voting. Anyway, I really appreciate that you are listening to me. I really do want Texas to get more progressive, less polarized, and so that we can work together. Thank you so much. And Stephanie, thank you for having me.
Thank you so much, Marilyn. We appreciate you being here tonight. Okay, we have some people that have dropped off. I just want to make sure that they're not still on under another number or something, or another name possibly. So Scott Kemp-Schaefer, I know you were in the chat just a few minutes ago. If you're still on, you're actually on the list of testifiers. I'm sorry, I don't know what happened, why you didn't get the email earlier. But if you're still here, please let us know in the chat. Okay, we're going to go down. Next on the list is Susie Nelson. Susie, are you here? If you can type in the chat if you are or not. Okay, next on the list is Jane Kernan. Jane, are you still here? Don't see her there either. Okay, gonna keep going. Elena Greer. Don't see her either. Okay, Claudia Stravado. There we go. No, that's Claudia Zapata. Okay, I'm gonna keep going. Stephen Weintraub, are you here? I know you asked a question to Michael earlier.
He is here and I'm promoting him now. Stephen, you can go ahead when you're ready.
Hi, I'm Stephen Weintraub. I'm a lifelong Austinite. And while I work in, while I work with various organizations that work on redistricting, I myself am, I lost my mouse, which will change my text. I myself am speaking for myself. I want to thank you for this opportunity to speak. I come to warn you that if you continue to gerrymander the state of Texas, as you have done in the past, all you're doing is eventually giving the radical Democrats like AOC control over the agenda of the state of Texas. Let me explain. When you gerrymander, you draw up tightly partisan districts, both Democratic and Republican. And as a result, the contests are decided in the primary. And those primaries get decided by the radical edges of both parties. When the election comes, it is a radical Republican versus a radical Democrat. And because the state is currently red, the radical Republican wins most of the time. But this will not always be the case. Eventually, Texas will be blue. As a result, radical Democrats will control the process, and those will be the policies we get. As Texas now pendulums between the radical right and the radical left, and possibly back to the radical right, policy swings with it, affecting all the laws from everything from taxes to schools. As a result, we create economic and societal uncertainty that makes it hard for businesses and individuals to prepare for the future, as each election makes planning like standing in quicksand. For a personal example, let me give you, I am retired. As healthcare policies bounce between the extremes, I don't know what my healthcare situation is from year to year. Each election becomes a nerve-wracking roll of the dice with my healthcare. The same could be said for my planning for my investments, knowing my tax load, deciding my purchases, and just about every other detail of my existence. The best, surest approach is centrist government. It leads to stability where individuals and businesses can plan for the security for year to year. To do this, you need to design fair, balanced districts where both sides have a chance and a centrist policy can be the mode we live by. On top of that, in such districts, all votes become valuable. People feel participation is useful. This builds civic responsibility and an environment that reduces stress, civil discord, and crime. So in short, it is in Texas' interest, the Republican Party's and the Democratic Party's interest to have good, clean, clear, fair voting maps. On top of that, I want to warn you about something I hear being batted around. You need only to use full population counts when drawing districts. It is the only method approved by the courts. To use untried methods like voting age people or only citizens will cause the Texas system to wind up in the courts and tie up our districts in trial for almost a decade. In the meantime, it is likely the court will suspend the districts drawn by the legislature and replace them with ones drawn by unelected judge. Let's not play games with our votes. They'll only end up hurting us. So in short, for my sake, for your sake, for Texas's sake, draw fair, compact districts. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen.
Up next, we have Leland Murphy. Go ahead and feel free to unmute yourself and turn your camera on if you want.
Hello, everyone. My name is Leland Murphy, and I'm a student at the University of Texas at Austin, and I'm here representing myself as well as the UT Senate of College Councils. So firstly, I would just like to start by saying the most important thing for this committee to do is to respect federal and state law, including the Voting Rights Act. None of my testimony today should be used by the legislator to justify diminishing the ability of a minority group to elect the candidate of their choice or artificially distorting maps for racial or partisan purposes. Now, we need fair redistricting for 2021. Every Texan deserves equal and equitable representation in our government. Texas's 25th Congressional District, which is the current district I live in when I'm attending UT Austin, is extremely gerrymandered. This district currently spans from Travis County all the way up to Tarrant County, so from Austin all the way to up to the DFW area, which is a length of approximately 190 to 200 miles. It is absurd that a congressional district can span this far and break up so many different communities. This gerrymander has weakened student representation and our representation in government. The area around UT Austin, including the main campus where I live, West Campus, which is where most of the private apartments for students are, and North Campus, which is mainly houses filled with UT students, all contain the majority of the undergraduate population. Yet students in main campus, West Campus, and some areas of North Campus do not even share the same congressional district. I can literally walk less than a block down from my on-campus dormitory into West Campus, and I will be in a completely different congressional district. The UT Austin student body is definitely a community of interest, yet current congressional maps don't represent this by dispersing students between multiple different districts. Students have many shared legislative concerns, especially relating to college affordability, funding for education, public transportation, fair wages for student employees, and so much more. Therefore, the students at UT Austin and in general students throughout the state of Texas need to be kept together when drawing these new districts. Our voice as students is being diluted, and we are being left out of representation in the halls of power in the state and federal government. My fellow UT students and myself, as well as other Texans across our great state who have been locked out of government, demand fair, equal, and equitable representation and demand there be more transparency in this upcoming redistricting process. Thank you all for your time.
Thanks, Leland. Okay. We've had a few people drop off the list. Next up is going to be Martha Spinks.
She should be on now. Martha, you can unmute yourself.
Good evening. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you just fine. Thank you. You can also turn on your video if you'd like.
All right.
There we go. Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Martha Spinks. I'm from San Antonio, Texas. I'm not representing any particular group. When I think about redistricting, I think the first and foremost message is take redistricting out of the hands of political parties. We're all fans of sports, and I don't think anybody would stand for it if we allowed OU to make the rules for a football game against the University of Texas. Nobody believes that's fair, and there's really no difference between that and what politicians are doing when they're gerrymandering. Of course, it deprives us of our voice as voters, but I think it deprives the whole country of vitality. The country's vitality is based on all kinds of ideas, big ideas, little ideas, outrageous ideas, ideas that don't catch on at first and then explode with success, and ideas that seem great at first and then we finally decide maybe we should give up on those because they're flawed. In my mind, politics and the election is one of the most important forums for this marketplace of ideas that have made us what we are. We compare candidates' ideas, and ideally, we're able to question and criticize the candidates and their ideas. Our vote should be our opportunity to accept or reject ideas and candidates. Gerrymandering deprives us of that ability to exercise our vote, but gerrymandering also deprives our country of that marketplace of ideas. If candidates win, no matter what they do, then they don't bother trying to present new ideas or making things better. New ideas are a threat to the status quo, and secure politicians rely on maintaining the status quo. We need to boldly pursue the big innovative ideas that made our country great. So when we start wondering why America is losing its place, we need to ask ourselves if it doesn't start with the way we elect and elect candidates and represent the people. That begins with politicians who are willing to stand by their ideas and take their lumps if the voters don't like their ideas. That's the courage, commitment, and honesty that's essential to protecting our democracy and getting us through a very challenging future that we all face. Thank you.
Thanks, Martha. Appreciate it. Okay, next up on the list, we have Lauren Simpson.
Hi.
Hi, we can hear you. Go ahead.
So my name is Lawrence Simpson, and I'm here representing an organization that I founded recently called the Voter Registration Network. What I noticed over the summer was that, first of all, there was very few organizations doing voter registration, public in-person voter registration. And so I brought it upon myself to get involved and bring more voter registration to Dallas County. What I observed is the reason why I wanted to speak tonight. There have been so many great discussions about how gerrymandering disenfranchises voters, how it creates districts where the extreme candidate wins, how it quashes ideas that could be flowing in our society. But there's one other effect that I have not heard discussed on any forum, and that is the devastating effect of the feeling of voter disenfranchisement. I talked to so many voters this summer who felt like their vote didn't matter. They didn't need to register to vote because their vote didn't matter. Their vote would be drowned out in their district. That is an immense effect on voter turnout and a real threat to our democracy. That's really the only point that I wanted to make tonight, was that this secondary effect of discouraging voters is so powerful, and I was introduced to it, and I had many discussions with people this summer about that very thing. So thank you for listening, and that's all I had to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Lawrence. Okay, up next we have Claudia Zapata.
Claudia, you can unmute yourself and show your video if you like. Wonderful. Thank you.
Can y'all see me?
Yes.
Hi. So my name is Claudia Zapata. I am representing myself. I'm currently a constituent of Texas District 35. I'm not going to sit here and pretend like what I have to say is actually going to influence the ways in which redistricting are done here in Texas. I live in TX 35, as I just stated, which is the 7th most gerrymandered district in the entire United States. The one thing that I do want to note, because I know that this will be transcribed, is that for all of you who are going to continue and redistrict the way that we always have been, which has completely disenfranchised and muted the voices of different voters, just know that the younger generation is watching. We are watching and we are learning, and we are not going to put up with it any longer. It is disgusting, the practices that are being done, and they are being noticed. And I just think that, you know, lastly, if you really do believe that your values are strong and they're well represented, and that you know your constituents, then why do you have to sink to such low levels and gerrymander the districts the way that you do? If you believe that you can actually win on good policies and doing better for your constituents, then you should not be terrified of gerrymandering correct compact districts. Thank you.
Thanks, Claudia. Okay, next up we have Jared Gunlock. Jared, go ahead and take yourself off mute.
Hi there. So many of the people who have spoken already tonight have really hit home a lot of the values that I feel like are fundamental to our national identity, and down to our state level, down to our counties, as well as it should be. And so I'd just like to add to that, regardless of party, for our representative democracy or democratic republic, if you will, to function properly, or at least at a bare minimum, we need to draw districts that are fair as possible. And if not fair by my definition, have it be fair by anyone's definition, because in the long run, no party is going to stay in power forever. The tide is always going to ebb and flow. So it's really in everyone's benefit to create as much of an unbiased and party favoring system as possible. A lot of other states already do this and do it quite well, be it with their independent redistricting boards and that kind of thing. Ultimately, that's what we need. I realize that politicians really only care about each election cycle, so this is going to fall on deaf ears for them. But for the people, we care about this, and it happens quite effectively in other places already. So I feel like it's just a matter of time before we have it too, and as well we should. Yeah, so that's essentially it. If politicians, if that's too tall of an order for them, you know, perhaps they should try something else, where a different calling, where their selfishness won't impede their ability to do their job or impact as many lives as they currently do. Try your local PTO or homeowners association, or become a deacon of your church. That'll be far less impactful to us if you do that. And I live in Houston, and the congressional districts here resembles more of a Jackson Pollock painting than it does nice, compact, geographical boundaries. Nobody with a clear conscience should find this acceptable. And I didn't realize District 35 was as bad as it was until I Googled it. And I thought that my district of 18 was bad, and it is. But looking at 35 just really drives home the point that we've got a lot of work to do, and that's what we should focus on now. Thank you.
Thanks, Jared. Okay, up next, Caleb Todd. Caleb, if you're on, we invite you to go next.
Hi, thank you. So my name's Caleb Todd. I'm in District 21, living in Austin. So I'd mostly just like to give my personal examples to really drive home how the gerrymandering in Austin splits apart our community. So I live in District 21. So that mostly contains land that is north of San Antonio in sort of smaller towns like Bandera, and then also swoops down, gets a bit of San Antonio, and then comes up and grabs some of Austin. So I'm grouped in with those communities, but it's about 10 minutes walk from me is District 35. So it's actually, so I'll walk over to District 35 to catch a bus or to walk my dog. Another couple miles, about 15 minutes drive to the other direction, the west of me, is an entirely separate district. Then going further north, up where my aunt lives, that's another district. Another 10 minutes north where my grandmother lives, that's another district. So when we're all grouped in with these rural communities, that means our communities and our families are split apart and our voices aren't recognized and we aren't given true representation for our communities. There's no logical reason why, all respect to the folks out in Bandera and such, but there's no logical reason why I would be best represented grouped in with them and not with my family members, my coworkers, even, basically my neighbors. I walk into a different district walking my dog. That's nonsensical. So it's just clearly so disgusting the way these districts are broken up. And I basically would like a nonpartisan community. I'd like at the very least for the maps to be released before they're voted on so that we can publicly comment on them. I guess if it does stay partisan, I guess I'd like the legislatures to keep in mind that Texas is changing pretty rapidly. If they don't establish rules to make this fair in the process, it might come back to them soon. So thank you for your time.
Thanks, Caleb. Okay, so everyone else that was on the list has either moved to Thursday or dropped off. So if there's anyone else that would like to provide testimony this evening, we've got plenty of time. You're welcome to do so now. If you want to raise your hand or type in the chat box, we'll get you promoted up.
We have Jose Menendez who has raised his hand. Jose, you can unmute or show your video if you like.
No, I'm fine, thank you. Yeah, good evening, everyone. This is Jose Menendez. I'm a state senator in San Antonio. I've been listening all evening to the testimony and to the meeting. I was appointed recently so far to the Redistricting Committee. We'll see if the committee will maintain its membership as we move forward. I can tell you that I agreed with just about everything I heard tonight. I have filed several sessions for an independent commission in Texas. I don't think that elected officials should be drawing their own districts. I think it's one of the biggest wastes of time and self-interested practices that we do. I think we should be working on legislation that advances people's rights. I think we should have an independent, as nonpartisan a commission as possible with some checks and balances in terms of the makeup. But as Michael said at the very beginning, that is a very long shot in terms of the Texas. Neither party want to give up their advantage and their power because they want to maximize the amount of time that they remain in power, and they want to maximize the retention of their incumbents. And so I want to encourage everyone to continue to stay informed, to come out and to testify. When the Senate Redistricting Committee starts advertising its committee hearings, I'd love to hear from everyone because at the end of the day, I've said this before, and that's the thing that frustrates me, is that it eventually, almost all of these maps will be either tweaked or redrawn by a federal judge or a judge panel. And your input, your dialogue, your testimony many times comes into play. So I think they will look at communities of interest. They will listen to people who are talking about the disgusting gerrymandering that goes on. And I think it's important that we make a very strong case so that we respect our community, so that we don't use the terms of redistricting crack and pack districts in order to gain partisan advantages. And so I just wanted to make sure that people knew and didn't feel as if they weren't being heard. I've been listening to attentively all evening, and I want you to know that you do have someone in office, who's already elected, who's not looking to make any points with anyone, but just something that I have a track record of believing and agreeing with you that we need to have competitive general elections so that we can have more people believe in the fact that their vote actually makes a difference and it matters, and that we can talking to a large population, large coalitions, and not just to the fringes that are the most active in primary elections. I think that's what's going to be best for our future and our democracy. And so thank you very much. Keep up the fight. Thanks to the League of Women Voters and to all of those who are engaged. Continue to stay engaged. We need you to be engaged. That's going to be the future of our state and our country. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator Menendez, for joining us tonight. That was very nice of you to be here. Before you go,
I'm here.
One of the things that is a big holdup right now that we're fighting for pretty aggressively is the ability for the Senate to have accept virtual testimony. We sent a letter to Chairwoman Huffman last week. She sent us a response back. She said that she's going to be introducing a resolution to the Senate at the beginning of the legislative session to allow for virtual testimony, specifically for the redistricting committee. So if you have any influence over Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick, yeah.
I will tell you, I had a meeting this morning with our chairwoman, and I know that she is committed to transparency, and she's committed to input from all corners of the state, and she is personally advocating for the virtual testimony so that people can testify from around the state. And so I am 100% supportive of that, and I do believe that when that resolution comes up, that resolution will get the necessary votes to be passed. I think it would be foolish and ridiculous of us as the elected officials not to ask and not to look for input from the community.
Thank you.
Thank you for asking to do that. I appreciate the pressure.
No, we appreciate your help.
Sure.
With that, is there anyone else that wanted to provide testimony this evening? Okay, if not, I'm going to formally end the hearing, but you're welcome to stay on and have a quick discussion about some calls to action. I also want to make sure that everyone that provided testimony tonight is comfortable with the process that we set up to submit your testimony to the legislator. And I just want to give you a quick rundown of how to do that and stuff like that. But everyone else, if you don't want to stay around for the updates and the calls to action and stuff like that, you're welcome to jump off. Don't forget, we're going to do this again on Thursday night. We're not going to have a guest speaker. We're just going to go straight to testimony. And we have, I think, about 23 people, but as you can see tonight, a lot of people that had signed up did not want to provide testimony. Hopefully they'll actually submit it directly to the House and Senate directly. So yeah, that will conclude the hearing portion of the event. Thanks to everyone who joined us. We appreciate it. Okay.
Thank you everyone for joining, and that concludes tonight's webinar.
Okay.
Have a great evening.
Oh wait, I was going to give them a quick update.
Sorry, I'm sorry. Apologize.
I was going to just do like the end of the transcript that we're sending off to the House and Senate and give them updates and make sure that everyone knows the procedures in place. So what we're going to do is we're sending this event. It's being recorded right now. So we're going to send it off to be transcribed. And then we're going to send a full transcript to both the House and Senate committees, redistricting committees. So it becomes part of the legislative record. Importantly though, Chairwoman Huffman wanted to make sure that everyone that provides testimony will send you the written transcript, no problem, but you need to submit that testimony to both committees yourself in your name, and I'll be sending up a follow-up email with instructions on how to do so. I think that was it. I wanted to do a quick call to action. So in the next day or two, the League of Women Voters and a few of the other members of the Fair Maps Texas Coalition want to turn up the pressure a little bit on the House and Senate for virtual testimony and virtual hearings in the upcoming session. This is very stressful, obviously, during the pandemic. We want to prioritize everyone's safety. At the same time, we have a right to be a part of the legislative process. And we want to push the House and Senate committees, especially for redistricting, to allow for virtual testimony in the upcoming redistricting session. So we will have a call to action. I know Lydia Ozuna with Texans Against Gerrymandering has a call to action on their Facebook page up. League of Women Voters will also be posting one in the upcoming days. It'll probably take a day or two to get it up. I'm not quite sure, I can't speak for the other members of the coalition, but you're welcome to go. I know several of us have been talking about what sort of actions our individual groups will be taking on this. So we'd appreciate your voice. We'd appreciate for you to speak up and put a little bit of pressure on the House and Senate. Again, it's not acceptable for either body to not accept virtual testimony during a pandemic. That's pretty ridiculous. You know, if you can be tried in a court of law here in Texas, which I know eviction hearings are going on. So if you can be evicted from your home, you should be able to provide input in the legislative process. Yeah, it just is a little mind-boggling to me. Trying to think of some other updates. I think that is it. So be on the lookout for that call to action in the next day or two. And thank you all so much for joining us tonight. I appreciate it. All right, take care.